Dr. Ben Jansen, it is so wonderful to have you here on the show. I'm really excited to ask you all the questions about cannabis because honestly, I'm tired of hearing it just from the US perspective. And I think we need to look at what's going on in our corner of the world, in Australia and New Zealand. So thank you for joining me today.
No problems at all. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you. Well, where I like to start is just this open question of what do you wish more people knew about cannabis?
That's a pretty open question because there's the exact same spectrum of knowledge, understanding, and stigma in medicinal cannabis in general, as there are cannabinoids out there. If you consider there's just a long history out there of it being used for really thousands of years, and then more recently, at the end of the 1800s and going to the 1900s, being used quite extensively around the world as a medicine when it was found to be beneficial for so many different things. So, in answer to your question, what would I like people to know most about cannabis? Number one, that it works for some people and it can be life changing for some people, but it doesn't work for everyone. So, when we look at it as from the doctor's perspective, we have to look at the patient as an individual and then the cannabis molecules as individuals.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. Okay, that's a beautiful place for us to start. Can we dive into a bit of the history and just where this story of cannabis has kind of twisted and turned along the way? Because when we first, how far back does cannabis usage go pertaining to your knowledge?
Potentially all the way back to China and the Chinese. But more recently, it was Sir William O'Shaughnessy who took up a position in Calcutta in India. He was an English chap, and he was a scientist. And he took the hemp and cannabis there and then refined it down and tested it first of all on animals, on dogs, and then developed tinctures to then be used with a standard way to make them. So you had a standard concentration or formulation, and then published that, and that was pushed out to the world through the different pharmacopoeia out there, and was used extensively, used by the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, and then used really extensively by doctors around the world. And it was the most prescribed medicine around the world up until it was outlawed,
And
which is
what happened?
amazing, isn't it? You think
Yeah,
about it.
it is amazing. Like, why did we get so afraid of cannabis? What happened to give it this reputation that we're going to sort of discuss a bit about those myths or those misconceptions around it. But what do you sort of see as happening in history, looking back on when it was outlawed, but being such a powerful substance that was so useful?
Yeah, it was came from the hemp plant, um, and hemp, as we know, is also very useful as a fiber. And the word canvas actually comes from cannabis. And to sail ships around the world, yep, you needed a hold of canvas or cannabis. And the sailors used to put these hemp seeds on their belt in case they got thrown off a ship. They could then hopefully get to shore, plant the hemp crop. They'd have some food, hemp seed, and then they have some fiber to make ropes and canvas as well. And around the turn of the century, synthetic fibers like nylon started to be produced, and hemp was seen as a threat to these patented fabrics. And to get rid of hemp in general, there was pretty much a strategic plan from the corporations to push it to the side and outlaw both the hemp plant, which originally was the very first law on cannabis in the US was actually a hemp law where if you're a farmer, you had to grow 100 plants. That was the first law. Um, and it's interesting, isn't it? And then the subsequent laws were outlawing it. So the corporations pushed on different buttons to get it outlawed. And around the time of prohibition turning over, the perpetrators of the prohibition had no job and were looking for something to do. So they sidled up and got a new job to promote cannabis a harmful product, and they put all sorts of interesting bits out on the media, calling cannabis marijuana, the term that the Mexican population used for it, and then inciting racism with that as well, saying that the people that used marijuana recreationally were these Mexicans who were coming in and taking our jobs, and it was the black people as well, and it just made people go crazy, and it made them want to do all sorts of illicit things, which just simply wasn't true. It was just hysteria.
Wow.
Yes, and
I'm
it's
literally
in
amazed
history.
hearing this.
If you have a look at some of the propaganda that came out, one of the things they said was that smoking marijuana cigarettes would make a white woman want to have sex with black men. Heaven forbid.
Wow.
Um, yeah, a lot of really weird and interesting things. And over the course of the prohibition time, which started with the first laws came in to limit the supply by doctors, and the Doctors Association of America actually wrote to try and petition to have these laws overturned, but to no avail. And they put the price up for getting a special authorized license to be able to prescribe cannabis and hemp products. And of course, that was prohibitive to doctors. And so they stopped prescribing, and then the synthetics started to roll in. And you've got the advent of opiates commercialized into the pharmaceuticals. And it kept rolling and rolling on. And the use of marijuana laws or anti-cannabis laws was a good tool by certain members in the governments to control the population. And there was corporate incentives to keep the cannabis medicine and out of the hands of the population, so that the corporations could keep pushing their own pharmaceutical, which they had a patent on.
Wow.
And there's some really interesting things around the 80s, 70s, and 80s. Nixon and Reagan both were anti-cannabis, trying to take a tough stance on it. And one of the more interesting studies that was done by scientists out there was when the White House commissioned, the Reagan commissioned a study into cannabis effects on the brain. And they commissioned a scientist, and they got the scientist to get some monkeys, and then made them have, forced them to have cannabis cigarettes through an apparatus. And then they killed them and looked at their brains to see what was the effect on the brain cells. And their first report was, we found no harm. So the White House said, do it again. And it's not the right answer.
Yeah.
So they did it again, but this time they did the study, and they gave them the equivalent of 30 cannabis cigarettes, which is a heap of smoke, over the space of 5 minutes. Why 5 minutes? Because at the end of 5 minutes, you have a monkey that's just alive because of the asphyxiation from that particular study or test. And then they would kill the monkeys, unfortunately, look in their brains and say, hey, there's some dead brain cells. And we're going to attribute that to the cannabis, as opposed to the hypoxia that was the actual causing agent. And it took 2 years of petition by people in the States to get the actual study protocol to see how they did it. And in that time, the news had already gone around the world for 2 years that cannabis kills brain cells, when right now the US currently holds a patent. The US Department of Health holds a patent on cannabis and cannabinoids being actually protective of brain and protective of brain cells.
Wow. Oh my, I'm finding this so fascinating. I had no idea. So now we have a situation where cannabis is associated with, firstly, just some sort of negative, it's, harmful for us, or it's, going to make us be crazy. And then the other side is it's going to make us lazy and stupid and damage our brain.
That's it. Yeah, that's the old stigma and myths. And that's what really blew my mind right back in the beginning, when I found out that the US government holds a patent, a 2018, I get the year wrong, but currently holds a patent on cannabis and cannabinoids being neuroprotective, because my mother actually died of a neurodegenerative condition, and we could have potentially prolonged her life or even alleviated some of her symptoms towards her demise. Yet this information is just completely opposite to what the government had been saying for 80, 90 years.
Yeah. And so your personal curiosity into all of this, Ben, what's that story about? Was it stemmed by your mother's condition, or did it begin before that?
It began around the same time. My journey actually started back in 2016 when the laws were changed in Australia to make cannabis rescheduled to be legal and prescribed. And at that time, there was plenty of information coming from overseas, from Canada and elsewhere, that there is a really good therapeutic potential for, and there is some really good miracle stories coming out, and you just have to scratch below the surface and have a read back into the history, and then have a read into some of these cases, and then now beyond that, we're actually getting more and more larger studies, controlled studies, which are showing potential positive effects from cannabinoids.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. And so, is cannabis dangerous? Is there any merit?
Well, everything's dangerous if you put too much of it on you. I mean, you can harm yourself by having too much water. So we need to absolutely address the fact that there is potential harms from using any molecule as a medicine. If we look specifically at first of all CBD, or cannabidiol, that's the cannabis molecule that doesn't make people feel sleepy, stoned, or high, and the one that we use more so for inflammation or anxiety. There is potential side effects from taking it. Now that has just been rescheduled by the TGA down to an S3, but that Schedule 3 being from the pharmacist, but that doesn't mean it's going to immediately be available, because pharmaceutical companies have to go through the process to get registered as such, which can take probably about 2 years from that change. But we prescribe that primarily for anxiety and inflammation, and it has been available since 2016. And I might just quickly whip back to the potential side effects, because that was where we were going with that. The potential side effects from the CBD are generally diarrhea, uncommon, a dry mouth potentially, tends to go away after a week, and potentially some patients have had an allergy to the carrier oil, because generally it's carried with an oil. So if you have a lot of oil, I think that can also potentially give you loose bowel motions as well.
Right.
And then I'll just quickly jump across to the potential side effects from the THC. And that THC molecule, that's tetrahydrocannabinol. That's the molecule that can make people feel sleepy, stoned, or high. And that's because it works differently. It actually binds onto nerves, and it turns down the nerve signal. And the most common side effect from THC is actually sedation, which might be helpful if you're trying to use it to go to sleep or you're trying to relax. But yeah, not so helpful if you want to do your work or drive a car. So there is restrictions on that as well. Those other side effects from THC are pretty uncommon if you do your dosing right. But you can feel increased hunger, red eyes. Some people can get anxious on the THC, and it's maybe around 1 in 5, 1 in 10, and potentially get so anxious that you feel a bit paranoid. There has been a long-standing myth that it causes schizophrenia, or makes people crazy, or hysterical, but that's been shown in recent times to not be exactly correct. THC can unmask schizophrenia in those that already have schizophrenia, or we're going to get it anyway, but it doesn't cause any additional schizophrenia. If you look at the use of THC around the world, and the rates of THC use have just been going right up, really skyrocketing. But the rates of schizophrenia have stayed completely stable.
Interesting.
So that's one of the real interesting myths that a lot of that stems from the propaganda back in the 30s.
Yeah, that it's going to give you some kind of mental health condition. It's going to make you crazy. What about, is there any merit to the concept that smoking weed frequently will cause anxiety and panic attacks, can trigger, especially people talk about the, term greening out, which is where you have too much and you are in that really heightened, possibly paranoid state. Is there any merit to that, Ben?
Yeah, so we do have some patients that, as we said, do get anxious from using THC.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of ways to counteract that. And first of all, with our patients would be to start low, go slow, use a small amount. It's better to have an underwhelming experience than an overwhelming experience. But also to add in CBD, cannabidiol, and that counteracts the THC effects to make people feel anxious. And that's more in line with the older plants. So over time, the THC has been bred up in a lot of plants for the THC effects, but having a flower or an inhaled product that has a balance of CBD and THC decreases those issues with anxiety. And THC isn't necessarily for everyone. And if a patient was to come to see us for anxiety, the first thing we would look to would be the CBD, cannabidiol, because that's got a lower side effect profile. It has a potential direct effects on the anxiety. And then if required, then we might look down towards the THC route. But we also have a lot of patients that turn up already who have been using green market or patient sourced, as we call it, cannabis, and they found that it works, and it works for them, makes them less anxious. And those patients tend to say, oh, look, I want to go straight down that route as well. But we say, well, let's look at our harm minimization model first.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like it can be a little touch and go depending on the patient with the use of THC and causing a sense of anxiety. But in terms of use of marijuana or cannabis leading to a long-term anxiety disorder, is there any merit to that one?
Long-term use of THC, there is some papers that suggest that. There hasn't been any really good controlled studies that show that.
Yeah. Okay.
And in my experience would be, yeah, those long-term users are then coming off. And there's pretty good data on withdrawal from cannabinoids. Is that once you stop, it really is pretty mild on any withdrawal effects from long-term high-dose THC use, and it may be 2 to 5 days of being a bit irritable or a bit more anxious, but not profound.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen anyone myself where they've been on long-term cannabis and it's really pushed up their anxiety. We take it away and they still have the anxiety.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like it's less about there being an association with, necessarily cannabis causes anxiety, but more about how are you using it, and what kind of cannabis combination is it? Are you combining that with the CBD component that's going to balance it out?
Exactly, and in the mode as well. So oral versus inhaled, and then when we talk about inhaled, we talk about different types of flower, and there's all sorts of funky names out there for these different strains, from Jack Herer through to Mango Haze to Pink Kush. These strains out there, and I didn't necessarily believe this when I first started out, the whole indica sativa effects on a person, and the cannabis sativa being more uplifting and the cannabis indica being more sedating, but very quickly we found out that actually those reports were true, and we have patients that say, yes, well, this particular strain actually, I do feel more awake on this one, this one's more relaxing. And the actual strain's effects really tend to be really patient specific. So we'll have a patient who might use a specific strain and say, oh, I feel really relaxed on it, makes me nice and sleepy. But then we'll have someone else who's used the exact same strain and say, well, it actually has the opposite effect. And that comes down to not only the THC and the CBD in the actual plant, and also the particular patient and their makeup of their receptors, but also the other molecules within the cannabis flower as well. And there'll be other molecules like terpenes, which give a lot of aroma and have their own potential effects as well.
Okay. So Is there any heightened risk or problem with consuming cannabis through inhaling it, smoking it? Is there a benefit? Is it better to ingest it? What's going on with the different modes of consuming it?
Mm, good question there. Yeah. Oral uses are preference because you're not taking a heated substance or heated molecules and bring them into your body. As soon as you heat anything for inhalation, they've got more reactive molecules and the potential for making free radicals and damaging molecules as well,
Of
which
course.
when then you inhale into your airways and down to your lungs has potential adverse effects, both to those lining, but then also into the other parts of the body as well. Um, when you compare it to cigarette smoking, well, smoking tobacco, as we know, is very harmful for individuals, causes high rates of vascular disease and heart attacks and strokes. But smoking cannabis doesn't seem to have anywhere near that risk. And it's a completely different plant with different molecules inside it. There's been long-term studies looking at the harms of regular cannabis use, smoking. Once you control for taking out the smoking tobacco, long-term use, and particularly the Dunedin longitudinal study, which has been running now for about 40 years, the difference they have found is that only really in gum disease.
Okay.
If you are going to, and this is to anyone out there listening, if you are smoking cannabis, we do recommend vaporizing. So that's using a electronic vaporizer, and it brings it down to a lower temperature, thereby decreasing the risk of harmful molecules being created.
Great. Okay. And so then the
Oh,
other,
sorry, I completely missed over your question as well. Why on earth would you inhale it?
yeah, why would you inhale it?
Why on earth would you do that in the first place? Well, the oral route takes about an hour to kick in for your THC, and the effects will last anywhere from 2 to 8 hours. And so we do have some people that use it for sleep, and they'll say, "Well, actually, that I wake up in the morning and I still feel a bit sedated." So in that situation, you might look to a faster acting mode of use. So that's where the inhalation vaporization comes in. The effects from inhaling it start to work almost instantaneously. But at 10 minutes, you're going to get your peak. You're going to get your peak of effects at 10 minutes. And then subsequently after that, the effects will last for anywhere up from 1 to 2, maybe 4 hours at a stretch, depending on the dosage there.
Right.
So if you're looking for an instantaneous relief, or you need to take it to go to sleep and you don't have lingering effects, or you've got a sudden onset migraine or a sudden spasm or pain, then you might use an inhaled THC. The inhaled CBD is uncommon to be used. It's pretty popular in the US. You see that promoted around the place. And some people with anxiety do use inhaled CBD, and it works for them. Our experience is it doesn't work for everyone as instantaneous relief of anxiety. And if you've got long-term anxiety, you probably should be using a regular CBD orally to cover yourself throughout the day. And then potentially you could try a CBD inhaled to see if you could get some acute resolution of your anxiety.
Right. So the oral dose being CBD oil, having it in a
CBD
carrier
oil primarily.
drops
Yep, it does come in
under the tongue.
capsules. We
Yeah.
do have topicals now in Australia for the last few months, which again are pretty popular overseas. Mainly not really used for anxiety, but mainly used for joint pains, that one.
Wow. And so you can get a really localized effect by rubbing an oil, say with CBD in it, on over a sore muscle or a sore joint.
Yeah, well, that's what our patients are reporting.
Yeah.
I've yet to see a good study on that being produced yet.
And now you often hear, I've heard some discussion around the difference when people have edibles, such as in the US, if any Aussies have been over there, and there can often be a higher risk of having a negative experience. Can you speak to that? Is that something that you've come across and researched as well?
Yeah, absolutely. The dose makes the poison for everything.
Yeah.
And it's better to have come up with your dose gradually and find the right dose. With your CBD, you're having an overdose on CBD is pretty uncommon, and no one has ever died from CBD or THC. But an overdose of THC is going to make you pretty anxious and potentially paranoid, and not feeling so well, and potentially greening out. And that commonly happens with oral THC when the patient has some, or a user has some THC, but then doesn't wait for it to kick in. So they're sitting around at 1 hour going, I'm not feeling anything. 1 hour, I might just have some more of this, usually an edible chocolate bar. In the States is what you hear. And they'll have the other half, or the gummies, and then whoa, there she kicks in, and then it really kicks in. So with the oral medication, we always say, look, wait at least 2 hours before having any more THC. And with your inhaled THC, wait 10 minutes, because that's when your peak of your effects are going to be happening.
Yeah, I certainly know, just anecdotally from people I've spoken to, anyone who's afraid of cannabis or had a negative experience, it typically goes back to something involving an edible, or having, brownies or something where it was just too much in the system that kicked in later, just like you said. So very interesting. It really does come back to dosage, knowing what you're doing, what the different ways of using it as well.
And just on that point, the THC, people respond to THC vastly differently. So 1 milligram of THC might make one person feel sleepy and stoned, versus my grandmother, for instance, who can take 60 milligrams and still go out gardening, doesn't feel a thing. But that would probably put me very much asleep on the couch.
Yeah. So that's also an important thing to know, is knowing your body and knowing what your body responds to, and that kind of thing, which I'm sure takes a bit of just bit by bit, seeing how you go, and probably working with someone who can guide you through that. The other thing that I'm interested in, so there's obviously, it helps us with anxiety, it can help us with pain management. You mentioned neuroprotective properties as well, that the cannabis can protect our brain cells and support our brain health. Are there any other benefits we've missed here?
The list is quite extensive. If we think about CBD, potentially anxiolytic, antipsychotic, anti-epileptic, because we know, especially in some of the children's studies, neuroprotection. It is a vasorelaxant, and is an antispasmodic, and anti-ischemic, and anti-proliferative potentially, an antiemetic to stop your being nauseated, potentially an antibacterial, mainly topically, anti-diabetic. I do have one patient uses it successfully for their diabetes, and their HbA1c dropped down by 1%, which is great. So we tested that. An anti-psoriatic, an intestinal antiprokinetic, an analgesic, potentially a bone stimulant, anti-inflammatory. What am I missing? Potentially immunosuppressive. I'd say more immunomodulative, and that's just CBD.
And immunomodulating, suggesting that it balances out the immune system if we've got say something like cancer happening. Is that what you're speaking to there?
More around inflammatory or autoimmune conditions. When we give CBD, we find that it does balance them out, not suppress the immune system, but brings it back into homeostasis. And the reason being is the CBD is interacting with your own natural internal endocannabinoid system, and it's boosting that up and making you more responsive to yourself.
Now, I want to ask you about this endocannabinoid system in our bodies, because I think this amazed me to learn about this, that we actually have a system in our body that, is the same as these molecules in the cannabis plant, that we're kind of topping up when we have cannabis, because so many people are afraid of cannabis, think, oh my gosh, we can't touch this stuff, it's bad for you. Yet we have those molecules in our body already. Can you tell us a little more about this system for those who don't know what it is?
Yeah, well, when I went to medical school now, and I'm 40 years old, so not too long ago, I guess, but there was no such thing as being taught about the endocannabinoid system. We were taught cannabis is bad, and no one should take it ever, and forget all the history. But it got studied by sorry, I'm going to take this back a little bit. The endocannabinoid specifically in there was not known about, and it was only because of trying to find out the effects of cannabis that it was eventually discovered. And so it was first of all looking at where the molecules of THC in cannabis actually bind onto. And well, lo and behold, we found a receptor, and it's right throughout the body, and it's in the brain and the nervous system. And we'll call it a cannabinoid receptor. And then they found another one. So, okay, we'll call that one cannabinoid receptor number 1, and that one cannabinoid receptor number 2. Okay. And then looking beyond that, what other receptors are there out there in the body that can interact with the cannabinoids? And there was a whole list of them. But then they had to work out, well, what's naturally occurring in the body? What's this molecules that are bonding onto these cannabinoid receptors that the THC and the CBD interact with? And lo and behold, found the endocannabinoids. So these are naturally occurring molecules that are made on demand by your own body cells in response to stressors. And there's the two major ones, AEA and 2AG. And the first one, AEA, was anandamide, named the bliss molecule, after the Sanskrit word anand, for bliss. And these molecules are produced, as we say, on demand for stress. Most common, an interesting time rather, when the endocannabinoids go up in your body is actually after exercise. And there was a study done in 2018, I believe, from memory, looking at the levels of endocannabinoids in the blood in depressed people after exercise. And they found a direct correlation between the amount of endocannabinoids you had and your depression.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So people who think that, they're afraid to touch cannabis, it's like you've already got it in your system, guys. When you go for a run, it's already there. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah. And at least these days, I talk to the medical school students coming out, and they are taught now about the endocannabinoid system, because this medicine's now very much in the forefront of a lot of people's minds.
Yeah. And so the idea of sort of taking cannabinoids through the cannabis derivatives, is that like, are we topping up our own system, or are we sort of, is it kind of like taking thyroid hormone when you've got a thyroid condition?
It's a nice analogy there, yeah. And I agree with that, especially with regard to CBD, cannabidiol. Taking that regularly to boost your own endocannabinoid signals if you have an issue. The proviso on that is, with my doctor hat on here, is that if there's not a problem, don't necessarily need to fix. But if you do have an issue, the idea would be to take a particular cannabinoid and then monitor yourself for your effects, because it doesn't work for everyone, but certainly for some people it's life-changing.
And what you've pointed out too is just another benefit of exercise. Like, we don't have to take this substance to, support our endocannabinoid system, do we? Like, we can go for a run, go work out. You're going to get that pain relief or an anxiolytic effect anyway.
Yeah. Do you know what the best type of exercise is?
What is it?
Daily.
Wait, say that again?
Daily. The best type of exercise is daily exercise.
Just something every day.
When I went back when I was doing my general practice, I had it on the wall behind me, and it was always a trick question.
Yeah, I love it. I appreciate that, because that's great. And it's so important. We get caught up in the ins and the outs of like doing it right, or, and it's just, at the end of the day, as long as we're moving our bodies, that's great. And that's the way we should be. So people who this is another like common one that comes up when cannabis is discussed. And that is, my family have a history of psychiatric disorders or mental health issues, so I won't touch it. What do you have to say to those people? Is there something to alleviate such a concern? Is there a need for such a concern?
There isn't a need for that concern if you're using cannabidiol, CBD, because it doesn't have this potential unmasking of the one thing that we're concerned about with THC, and that's unmasking of schizophrenia. THC is, it's a potentially very sedative molecule if you take too much of it. Lie down, be sleepy, stoned, or high. Yeah. So anyone that does have a personal history of schizophrenia, then we would be very cautious around using THC. Or if there's a family member that has had schizophrenia, then we would just be cautious around that as well. And we'd need to do a risk benefit analysis on that particular person. Now, we do have some people with schizophrenia that we do treat with THC, and I have personally about 6 of them And the very first one, interesting chap came in with his mum, a 23-year-old. And he said, "Oh, look, I want the THC flower. I smoke that and it makes my voices go away." I went, "Oh, that's pretty interesting. What do you think, Mum?" She's like, "Yeah, when he uses THC, he's a much better person to be around, and he doesn't have these voices." I went, "Oh, that's unheard of. I hadn't read that anywhere." We tried the CBD first of all. Didn't work very well for him, but did help him with feeling a bit better. And then we cautiously trialed the THC flower. And he came back in next time and he said, "Doc, mate, thanks." He cried. He'd been using a pharmaceutical grade THC flower, which he found better. His voices were down. He had got his job back. He was going to work, and he was happy. So it's the whole schizophrenia and THC side of things is a pretty interesting one, because there are some people that say it does work positively for them.
Yeah.
But if there's just a history of anxiety or in a distant family member, then we'd unfortunately lump you in with the risk for everyone else.
How about in the situation of addiction? My family has a history of addiction, or I have a history of addiction. Do we need to be extra cautious?
Yeah, CBD is non-addictive, and that's according to the World Health Organization. THC is less addictive than coffee, and that is according to the World Health Organization. So there are some people that still abuse any substance, and there are some people out there that use too much THC potentially, and to their detriment. That they can use too much THC and then have adverse effects on income, family, or just being alert and cognitive. Because if you have too much THC, you're going to be quite sedated.
What classifies as too much THC? Is it just being high all the time?
Potentially, yeah. We have to look at the individual, I think. And if someone has a really traumatic past, this is just an example, with horrendous PTSD, and the only way that they can get through their day is by having a pharmaceutical of some description. And they've tried some of the other pharmaceuticals out there, and then they look to THC and they find that works. Well, in that particular case, that would be pretty reasonable for the person to use THC on a long-term basis. The question would be to get you down to just a feeling of relaxation versus going all the way through to taking a lot and being quite sedated.
Yeah, okay. And part of that risk-benefit profile is that obviously there's far fewer side effects that come with THC compared to a lot of our pharmaceuticals.
Potentially, absolutely. I've seen people that have tried the SSRIs, and they got the side effects of their anxiety going up, or sexual dysfunction, and then moving on to the other ones, olanzapines, etc., and having the side effects of weight gain, or liver toxicity, renotoxicity, and then trialing a THC and finding that it works. I think treat the patient, not the guideline.
Yeah.
And always be very upfront and make sure that you are informed with what your treatment is and what the risks that are involved.
Yeah, absolutely. It always is going to come back to that individual and getting that health advice for you. What about in terms of, because there's obviously a lot of, I don't want to go too much into this comparing to the other pharmaceuticals available and things like that. But, for, say, a woman wanting to become pregnant, but she's dealing with terrible anxiety, a lot of our pharmaceuticals are, contraindicated in pregnancy or trying to get pregnant. Where does cannabis kind of fit into that picture?
That's an interesting question, and I'll answer it in two parts. First of all, the legal part.
Okay.
Any medication that the patient takes or person takes when they are pregnant or trying to get pregnant or breastfeeding is really up to them, and they need to be informed about any potential risk. And there is always a potential risk of taking any pharmaceutical. If we look at the CBD, the cannabidiol, first of all, that's sold over the counter around the world with no restrictions on pregnancy or breastfeeding. the products that we supply, if anyone wants to get pregnant, we as doctors, we have no issue with that. We don't think that would be a detriment to the fetus or the mother. With regard to the THC, it would be taking the individual and informing them of potential risk. And what's the potential risk from using THC in pregnancy? Well, it's not actually harmful to the fetus. There's been pure recreational users and medicinal users using really high doses without reports of really significant effects on fetus mother. But we could not recommend that as a standard practice because there is potential risk, and the products that are coming out and being used, they haven't been tested on a large scale of pregnant women in a controlled study, and that's really where you're going to get your pregnancy data from is actually running trials with a specific product on pregnant women.
Yeah. Okay. Now you mentioned that cannabis is not for everyone. We've sort of talked about the pregnancy issue. We've talked about history of mental disorders, including schizophrenia. Is there anything we've missed there? The sort of things you sort of look out for someone who cannabis is not for?
The difficult one, is the most difficult. I'll tell you the most difficult thing for us to treat, and it tends to be kids, because patients and parents come in with high expectations after seeing news articles generally, and coming from a difficult situation, being that a autistic child or developmentally delayed child, or a child that has indolence seizures or epilepsy. And for some kids, we find it just works a treat. Works really well either for the autism or the anxiety, but they are the minority of patients. More often, it doesn't work well enough for the symptoms or the issues involved, and that's always a difficult for the parents, and then also for us as well, because we want this to work, but we have to be realistic about the actual percentage of patients where it will work.
Okay, I understand. Now, with the cautions we've spoken about in mind, I must share that personally, I find it incredibly frustrating looking at the majority of the world where at least CBD oil is available quite widely. And yet in Australia, there are still many hurdles and barriers to access it. Where are we at on that? And why is it that we cannot also access CBD oil over the counter in Australia? Is it still just a stigma?
No, it's the legal side, and THC has been rescheduled to Schedule 8, so that's a controlled drug where you need a prescription, and you also need authority to do that as well. So a doctor can prescribe it. We've been prescribing it for years now. The CBD is Schedule 4 prescription, and that is readily available from doctors that do prescribe. There's still a bit of learning from doctors to know how to do it. And also Schedule 3, but only through the pharmacy, Schedule 3, if there's a registered product. And our company is working on that, but I know a number of other companies are working on that as well. But it will still take probably another year before you start to see products available on shelves and in pharmacies. And that would be restricted to over 18s, and it will be for specific conditions. So for it to be over the counter from a pharmacist for anxiety is very highly unlikely. And the reason being is anxiety and self-diagnosis of anxiety is something that the TGA doesn't necessarily agree with. They think it should be diagnosed by a physician.
And yet incredibly frustrating given that it is so widely available in other parts of the world. And as we've discussed, pretty safe with, some cautionary measures and knowing how to dose it and knowing how to take it. Certainly looking at how available and accepted alcohol consumption is in our country and our culture. I just find it a huge, huge shame that there is essentially these hoops that we need to jump through. Like, why is alcohol so readily available, which people are using to treat their anxiety? They do use it to wind down, to take the edge off. And it's just frustrating that we can't access it. But you're saying that potentially a year from now, we might have a situation where we can go and more easily access it here?
Yeah, and you do see it, it does frustrate us a bit because we have been trying to do the right thing for many years now. When we see illicit supply still available on the internet out there, and there's a cautionary tale there because Stephen Ing actually had a look at the different products out there available in Australia through the internet and found that a majority of them didn't actually have what they said in the label. And they don't have the safety and testing behind it. And so what we have to prescribe is pharmaceutical grade product through our process. And so all our products have been tested to pharma grade.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying with alcohol. I have a real stickler about nicotine um, and its availability. Because
Same kind of thing, right?
yeah, who can buy? Answer me this: who can buy nicotine?
Kids over 18, can't they?
Mostly correct. So cigarettes over 18. Okay. What about if you wanted to use, like a Nicorette oral spray? Who can buy that?
Pretty much anyone.
Correct. Technically, there's no restriction on that. You go down your pharmacy and a child can buy that.
Wow.
And it's got a child-proof lock on it, but my 8-year-old can open that lock.
Yeah, and access
Oh.
it. So this is, yeah, I suppose we can sit here and be frustrated at these things and these sort of hurdles to jump through. If in a year from now it might be more easily available for certain conditions, when could we potentially see someone that's just wanting to manage their everyday stress and that everyday anxiety, being able to access something like CBD oil? And I'm not saying the THC, which obviously comes with more risks and things like that, but just CBD oil. But we can, fly, I mean, if we could fly to the UK or to the US, you can walk into a store and there it is.
Next Christmas.
You think?
Yeah, or in by Christmas, as the saying goes. We'll be in by Christmas, but they never say which Christmas.
Right.
I think it would be sometime late next year that we'll finally get through all the reviews that need to be done, all the process validation, and then finally start to see products on shelves. And it will probably be for chronic pain issues initially, and then develop from there.
Yeah. Okay. I really appreciate you discussing that with me, because that's like a personal peeve, and I'm like holding back here. But
You just can become a patient of ours.
yes. So what are those steps? So someone that just wants to access it today and they are, managing anxiety, what can someone do legally through the system so we can see our doctor?
Absolutely. First of all, speak to your own doctor. If they don't know how to prescribe and they want to learn, they can come to our website, canview.com.au, and do the Confident Cannabis Prescriber course. But if they are knowledgeable and willing, then just get a simple referral through to us at cannabisdoctorsaustralia.com.au, and our patient care team is on the website there, and they'll guide all of our potential patients through the consultation process, and make sure that you know exactly the ins and the outs of cannabis medicine as we consult with you.
And for someone who just wants to keep up with the work you're doing or support your efforts and everything you're doing, where can we find you?
My personal address, I can't put that on the podcast.
Not the personal address.
Thank you, Georgie. I put your no.
Just a website or a social account would be amazing.
But have a look at it. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and we're on our website there, cdaclinics.com.au or cannabisdoctors.com.au. And then our other branch is the canview.com.au, which is there for doctors and pharmacists to learn and access medicinal cannabis products, and then also for our patients to learn more as well.
Fantastic. Well, keep doing what you're doing. I'm going to have all that information on the show notes so everyone can go find you. Really, really appreciate this chat. It's been so fascinating, and just really an honor to sit here and hear your wisdom about it all, because you've clarified so many things, and I'm just so excited to share this episode with all my people and my people in my personal life too. I'm like, you're going to have to go listen to this episode.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much to the listeners out there. I'll also put a couple of links on there. One's going to be a review article on CBD and cannabinoids for anxiety, and the other one is also a resource there where you can type in your condition or diagnosis, and it will bring you up the cannabis related articles.
Oh, perfect. That sounds excellent. Thanks so much, Ben.
No worries. You have a great day, everyone, and hope to see you in clinic there, Georgie.
Yeah, I'll be seeing you soon.
Very good.